In April of 2010, Comedy Central received a finished episode of South Park, reviewed it, and then quietly removed the ending. The specific content they removed was a speech about how threatening people with violence is the only real power anyone has over a free society. They removed it because someone had threatened them with violence. That is one story. There are 9 more. South Park has been running for nearly 3 decades, and in that time has been banned by governments, erased from an entire country's internet, sued by a church, targeted by death threats, and forced to say goodbye to a cast member whose resignation letter was written by people acting without his knowledge while he recovered from a stroke. Every single time, the show kept going. What those 10 scandals reveal, placed side by side, is something no single controversy communicates alone. A picture of how far the world will go to silence something it finds unbearable, and what happens when the thing being silenced refuses to stop. Welcome to East Park. Let's get into it. The death threats. There is a 2-minute speech at the end of a South Park episode that most people have never heard. Not because it was deleted before the episode aired. Not because the writers changed their minds. The speech was written, recorded, and delivered to the network exactly as intended. The network received it, reviewed it, and then covered it in a long, unbroken audio bleep so nobody watching at home could make out a single word. The speech was about how threatening people with violence is the only true power. It was about how intimidation works. It was about how companies cave when someone threatens them, and how that caving only teaches people to keep threatening. Every word of it was bleeped out after a radical group made threats against the people who made South Park. The show made its own point by being silenced. Nobody at Comedy Central seemed to notice the problem with that. This is how it happened. South Park had been on television for 13 years by the time it reached its 200th episode in April of 2010. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had spent those 13 years going after nearly everything. Politicians, celebrities, religions, corporations, cultural moments, and each other's blind spots. Nothing was safe. That was the deal. The show had made that clear in its first season, and it had honored the deal consistently enough that audiences trusted it meant what it said. For the milestone 200th episode, Parker and Stone decided to bring back nearly every major controversy the show had ever created. Former celebrities who had been mocked, old plot lines, characters who had been retired. The whole episode was structured as a look back at everything the show had done that made people angry, and it centered on the one figure the show had always struggled to use freely, the Prophet Muhammad. The history with Muhammad goes back to 2001. South Park aired an episode called Super Best Friends, in which Muhammad appeared as a heroic character alongside Jesus, Buddha, and other religious figures. Nobody complained. The episode came and went without incident. But between 2001 and 2005, the world changed. A Danish newspaper published cartoons depicting Muhammad, and the response in parts of the world was violent. Riots broke out. Buildings were burned. The artists who made those cartoons received death threats that forced them into hiding. By the time South Park wanted to use Muhammad again in 2006, Comedy Central was already nervous. In 2006, Parker and Stone made a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars, in which the network Family Guy was about to air an episode featuring Muhammad in a cutaway gag. The South Park episode argued that if you could mock Jesus freely but not Muhammad, you were treating one religion differently from another. Comedy Central agreed with the argument in theory, but refused to show Muhammad's image in practice. They censored the character with a black screen during the broadcast. Parker and Stone were frustrated. They made the episode about censorship, and their own network censored it. 4 years later, they came back to the same argument with more force. The 200th episode aired on April 14th, 2010. In the story, Tom Cruise leads a group of celebrities in a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park. Every famous person the show had ever mocked over the years joins the suit. Cruise offers a deal. He will make the lawsuit go away if the town can bring him the Prophet Muhammad. The logic inside the story is that Muhammad alone among public figures cannot be mocked. He is immune to criticism and ridicule, and Cruise wants that immunity for himself. So does every other celebrity. The character of Muhammad appears throughout the episode, but his image is hidden behind a large black box with the word censored on it. His name was spoken freely. The episode ended on a cliffhanger. Between the broadcast of episode 200 and the broadcast of episode 201 1 week later, a group called Revolution Muslim posted something on their website. Revolution Muslim was a small organization based in New York. Law enforcement officials who monitored them described the group as mostly talk, no real capability for violence. But the post they published was not simple criticism. They referenced Theo Van Gogh by name. Van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in 2004 by a man who objected to a short film Van Gogh had directed about the treatment of women in Islam. The Revolution Muslim post said that Parker and Stone would probably end up like Van Gogh. It included the the addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and the production studio in California where South Park was made. Comedy Central received the post. They made a decision. Episode 201 aired on April 21st, 2010. Parker and Stone had written and recorded the episode exactly as they intended it. They delivered the final version to the network. The network then added changes without informing the creators. Every time a character in the episode said the name Muhammad, the audio was replaced with a long bleep. Every image of Muhammad was covered by the same black censored bar from the previous episode. The episode's ending, a sequence in which Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus each deliver a speech wrapping up the moral of the story, was buried under bleeps so long and so complete that audiences watching could not understand a single sentence. The next day, Parker and Stone released a statement on the South Park Studios website. They confirmed that Comedy Central had inserted the bleeps after the episode was submitted. They were direct about what had been covered up. Kyle's speech, they explained, had nothing to do with Muhammad. It did not mention him at all. The speech was about how threatening violence is the only real power anyone has over a free society. It was about how intimidation works. It was about how companies cave under the threat of harm and how caving teaches the people making threats that the strategy is effective. Every word of that speech was bleeped. A speech about how censorship through fear works was censored because of fear. Parker and Stone said they had never in 14 years delivered an episode they could not stand behind. This one had been taken from them. The response from critics and journalists was intense. The head of a New Zealand newspaper described what Comedy Central did as possibly the lowest point in the history of American television. A law professor at UCLA noted that by censoring the episode, the network had sent a clear message to everyone watching. Threaten violence against a media company and that company will do what you want. The professor argued this would encourage more threats, not fewer. A critic from a Canadian newspaper called it a surrender to fear that television should be ashamed of. 17 Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonists signed a petition condemning the threats against Parker and Stone. The names on the petition included some of the most respected working journalists in the field. Revolution Muslim had no meaningful capacity for violence. Law enforcement said so clearly. The group was mostly young men posting online. They were not a cell. They were not organized in any serious way. But the threat of violence, even from a small and probably incapable group, had been enough to make one of the largest media companies in America rewrite the ending of a television episode about exactly that dynamic. Episode 201 never re-aired on American television. It was removed from the Comedy Central schedule permanently after its single broadcast. Both 200 and 201 were pulled from every streaming platform. For years, they were also absent from the show's official website. They remain unavailable on streaming today. The only version most people have seen came from a leak online years later. The uncensored version of episode 200 eventually made it onto DVD. The uncensored version of 201 did not. The DVD release of season 14 included both episodes, but 201 still carried the original network bleeps. When Parker and Stone recorded audio commentary for the DVD, they referred to Muhammad throughout only as the Prophet of the Muslim faith. They never said his name. They noted at one point that they were not supposed to discuss what had happened. A long bleep covered that moment too. The broader conversation about what Comedy Central did rippled for months. One argument said the network had made a reasonable business and safety decision in a volatile moment. Another said the network had handed a victory to people who wanted to decide what could and could not be said on American television, and that the next group of people to issue a similar threat had just been told the strategy works. Both arguments have been made by serious people, and neither has been fully resolved. What is not in dispute is this. South Park made an episode that argued censorship through intimidation is wrong. The episode was censored through intimidation. The specific words that got bleeped were the ones that made that exact argument. Parker and Stone knew what they were doing when they wrote those speeches. The whole structure of episodes 200 and 201 was built toward Kyle's final monologue. The celebrity lawsuit plot, the Muhammad immunity plot, the callbacks to every past controversy, all of it was scaffolding for a single point delivered at the end. The only true power is the power to make people afraid. Companies will do what you want if you threaten them. The audience for South Park spent 13 years watching a show that said it would never flinch. Then they watched the show get flinched at by the network airing it. The episodes have been gone from legal streaming for 15 years. A show that made its reputation on saying everything that was not supposed to be said now has 5 episodes that cannot be watched legally anywhere. Every one of those 5 episodes features Muhammad. Super Best Friends, the 2001 episode where Muhammad first appeared as a hero with no controversy whatsoever, was was quietly banned from streaming years after it aired. Not because anyone objected when it first went out, but because the later episodes created a context that made having Muhammad appear anywhere in the show's archive feel like a liability. A character who appeared in one episode in 2001 with zero reaction became permanently unwatchable 13 years later because the world had changed and the company that owned the show decided that the safest thing was to make him disappear entirely. The show that named itself after a town called South Park and built its identity on the premise that nothing was off limits had, by 2010, a small but permanent set of things that were off limits. Not because Parker and Stone chose them, because someone else made the choice for them, and the network accepted it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened with the Muhammad episodes is the most dramatic example of outside pressure forcing South Park into silence. But the most personal version of that story, the one where the show's own cast became the casualty, started with a personality test on a street corner, a closet that a cartoon man refused to leave, and a voice actor who would never record another line for the show he had helped define. Section 2. The Scientology Takeover. Isaac Hayes had been the voice of Chef since the very first episode of South Park in 1997. For 9 seasons, he played the school cafeteria worker who gave the kids advice, sang them songs that were wildly inappropriate for children, and became one of the most recognizable voices in the show's history. He was not a background character. He was not a guest. He was part of the core of what South Park was. And then, in March of 2006, he was gone. And the way he left, and what actually happened to force him out, remained hidden for a decade. The episode that started everything aired on November 16th, 2005. It was called Trapped in the Closet, and it was the 12th episode of season 9. Trey Parker wrote and directed it. The premise is straightforward. Stan Marsh takes a free personality test offered by Scientologists on the street, answers the questionnaire, and is told he scored so high that he must be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the man who founded Scientology. Stan gets pulled into the organization, he becomes their leader, he starts reading Hubbard's writings and realizes he has no idea what he actually believes. The secondary plot is where the episode's real cultural impact lives. Tom Cruise, playing a fictionalized version of himself, shows up at Stan's house. Stan, who is being pressured to keep the Scientology charade going, refuses to tell Cruise he is a great actor because Stan thinks Cruise is not actually that great. Cruise takes this personally and locks himself in Stan's bedroom closet, refusing to come out. Other characters, John Travolta, R. Kelly, all of them playing themselves, arrive at the house and try to talk Cruise out of the closet. Every scene is built on the same joke. Cruise is literally in a closet and will not come out, while the dialogue around him plays on every possible meaning of that phrase without ever stating it directly. The show laid out the actual belief system of Scientology in detail, on screen, presented as plain fact, with a title card that read, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The episode made clear that the story of Xenu, a galactic ruler who killed billions of people by dropping them into volcanoes on Earth, was a belief that members only learned after paying significant amounts of money to advance through the church's ranks. This information was not invented. Parker and Stone had worked with a journalist named Mark Ebner, who had written about Scientology extensively and who helped make sure the details were accurate. The end credits of the episode listed every cast and crew member as either John Smith or Jane Smith. Every single one. The joke was about the reputation both Cruise and the Church of Scientology had built for suing people who criticized them. By making the credits anonymous, Parker and Stone were making a public joke about the possibility of legal retaliation before any retaliation had even been threatened. The episode was a hit. It got strong ratings, critics responded well, there was no immediate legal action. The Church of Scientology internally considered its options and decided not to sue, having concluded their legal case was too weak. But the day after the episode aired, a senior Scientology official named Mike Rinder, who has since left the organization and become one of its most prominent critics, wrote an internal memo to the church's leadership. The memo laid out a plan for dealing with the South Park episode. It confirmed that Isaac Hayes had been informed about the episode after it aired, and that he was, in Rinder's words, very upset. Hayes had not been told the episode was being made. Parker and Stone made the decision to keep him in the dark, specifically so that Hayes would have what they later described as plausible deniability, so nobody could accuse him of knowing and approving it in advance. Hayes found out the same way everyone else did, by watching it or being told about it afterward. For a few months, Hayes seemed to be managing the situation. In January 2006, he gave an interview to a publication called the AV Club. He acknowledged he was unhappy with the episode. He said he understood what Parker and Stone were doing. He did not quit. He did not issue any public statement demanding changes. He said, in his own words, that he understood. Then he had a stroke. In January 2006, around the time that interview was published or shortly after, Isaac Hayes suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak clearly or make decisions for himself. He was significantly impaired. He needed help with basic functions. He was not capable of conducting his professional life independently. In March of 2006, a public statement appeared under Hayes' name, announcing that he was leaving South Park. The statement said he was quitting because of the show's treatment of religion. It used language very similar to the Church of Scientology's own internal response to the Trapped in the Closet episode. Language from Render's memo about how satire ends and intolerance begins. The statement presented Hayes as a principled man making a choice for moral reasons. Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, spent years trying to correct the record. In a 2016 interview published in The Hollywood Reporter, alongside Parker and Stone on the occasion of South Park's 20th anniversary, Hayes III stated clearly that his father did not write that resignation letter and did not make that decision. His father had suffered a stroke. He could not speak clearly. He had no real comprehension of what was happening around him. He was not in a position to resign under his own understanding. Everyone around Hayes at that time, his assistants, the people in his immediate circle, were Scientologists. Someone in that circle quit South Park on Hayes' behalf. Hayes III said they did not know exactly who. Matt Stone confirmed the account. He said the situation became clear to Parker and Stone a bit later, but that it was, in his words, totally what happened. Hayes III added a specific point that cuts to the center of everything. His father had been part of a show for 9 seasons that made fun of black people, Jewish people, gay people, and virtually every other group and individual that South Park had ever touched. Hayes had stayed through all of it. He had cashed the checks and recorded the lines and showed up to do the work. Hayes III argued his father would not have been such a large hypocrite as to stay through all of that and only resign when Scientology was the target. That was not who his father was. The hypocrisy in the resignation statement was itself evidence that the statement was not written by Hayes. Hayes died in August 2008 from another stroke. He and Parker and Stone never fully reconciled. Parker and Stone have said they figured out what happened before Hayes died, but that there was not a clean resolution. The relationship ended without the full truth being said out loud between them. The immediate aftermath for the show was handled in a way that reflected how genuinely angry Parker and Stone were. They had lost a cast member they had worked with for nearly a decade, not through any honest falling out, but through an organization that they believed had exploited a sick man's incapacity to end his career without his knowledge. Their response was to write Chef out of the show in a way that made clear they felt the character had been taken from them under false pretenses. In the episode that followed Hayes' departure, called The Return of Chef, Parker and Stone used clips of Hayes' voice from previous episodes stitched together to have the character speak one last time. There was no new recording. Hayes was gone, so they assembled old audio into new sentences and used that to tell a final story. At the end of the episode, Chef is struck by lightning, burned, impaled on a spike, and then attacked and killed by both a mountain lion and a grizzly bear. His body is then brought back to life by the villains of the episode and turned into something like a dark, corrupted version of who he was. The character who comes back at the end has the shape of Chef, but none of who he actually was. Parker and Stone were not subtle about what they were doing. The episode was about a beloved person being taken from his own life and turned into something else by a group that had captured him. They believed that was exactly what had happened to Isaac Hayes in real life. Meanwhile, the rebroadcast of Trapped in the Closet became its own separate controversy. The episode had been scheduled to re-air on Comedy Central on March 15th, 2006, 2 days after Hayes' resignation letter appeared. Comedy Central pulled the episode without announcing it in advance and replaced it with a different South Park episode. The network said this was out of respect for Hayes in the wake of his departure. The press immediately reported a different explanation. Reports from multiple sources said that Tom Cruise had contacted Viacom, the parent company of Comedy Central, and made clear that he would not participate in promotional activities for Mission Impossible 3, which Paramount was about to release if the episode re-aired. Paramount was also owned by Viacom. The reports suggested that Viacom had made a business calculation. The money at stake with a major Tom Cruise film was larger than any cost that came from pulling a single South Park rerun. Cruise and his representatives denied having made any such threat. Comedy Central said the scheduling change was about Hayes. Parker and Stone chose not to accept either explanation explanation quietly. Their response through their lawyer was published by NPR and other outlets. It said, among other things, "Scientology, you may have won this battle, but the million-year war for Earth has just begun." It described themselves as servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. It was written in a tone that made clear they found the entire situation both infuriating and, on some level, exactly as absurd as anything they had ever put on screen. The episode eventually returned to regular rotation and has continued airing since. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in 2006. One of the clearest possible signals from the broader television industry that the episode was considered significant work regardless of the controversy. TV Guide ranked it among the top 20 television episodes of all time across any genre. The Church of Scientology never found a legal avenue that worked. Ebner, the journalist who consulted on the episode, continued working with Comedy Central without interference. The church's internal attempt to discredit him did not produce results. The legal threat implied by the John Smith credits never materialized into an actual lawsuit. What the church did accomplish was quieter. A man who had built 30 years of his career partly on his work as chef was publicly associated with a resignation he did not write, based on a position he may not have held, because the people managing his life during a medical crisis made a decision without him. He died 2 years later with that version of the story still attached to him publicly. Hayes III has been consistent and clear every time the subject comes up. His father would not have been that hypocritical. His father did not quit South Park. Scientology did. Parker and Stone have said they agree. The episode they made about Scientology is still considered one of the best things South Park ever produced. The episode about Muhammad from the same era is permanently unavailable. Both of them caused serious real-world consequences. Both of them led to something being taken from Parker and Stone against their will. In one case, a cast member, and in the other, the freedom to air their own work. The difference is that Scientology lost in every arena that mattered. The episode stayed on television. The Emmy nomination came through. The legal threat evaporated. Hayes' departure hurt the show personally, but it did not break it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. China tried a different approach entirely, and the result was something Parker and Stone probably knew was coming before they even finished writing the episode that caused it. Section 3, The China Scrub. On October 2nd, 2019, South Park aired the second episode of its 23rd season. The episode was called Banned in China. By the following week, the entire show had been erased from the internet in the world's most populous country. Every episode, every clip, every fan discussion, every social media post, gone. Not reduced, not filtered, completely and permanently removed, as though South Park had never existed at all in China. Parker and Stone responded with a statement they titled Official Apology to China. The statement read, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. Xi doesn't look like Winnie the Pooh at all. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May the autumn sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China?" They were not sorry. They knew exactly what they had done, and they had done it on purpose. To understand why China erased an entire television show over a single episode, and why Parker and Stone responded the way they did, the episode itself needs to be understood first. Banned in China tells two stories at the same time. The first follows Randy Marsh, who decides to travel to China to expand his marijuana business called Tegrity Farms. Randy arrives in China and almost immediately gets arrested because selling marijuana is illegal there. He ends up in a forced labor camp. Inside the camp, he meets Winnie the Pooh. Not the Disney character exactly, but a character who looks exactly like Winnie the Pooh, sitting in a Chinese prison because the Chinese government had banned images of the character after people on the internet started using pictures of Pooh to compare the physical appearance of Chinese President Xi Jinping to the cartoon bear. The Chinese government found this offensive and banned the character. South Park put him in a prison camp. The second story follows Stan, who starts a death metal band. A music producer approaches the band and tells them he wants to make a movie about their story. Stan is excited. He desperately wants to leave Tegrity Farms. The movie deal feels like a way out, but as filming begins, the producer explains that certain things will need to be changed to make the film work in China. One band member is gay. That gets removed because China does not allow positive depictions of gay characters in film. Another element of their story involves drug use, also removed. The script keeps getting stripped down further and further, with Chinese censors literally standing on set approving or rejecting every scene. Stan eventually faces the core choice the episode is built around. He can compromise everything about his story to get the movie made in China and get the money and escape from the farm he wants so badly, or he can refuse to change anything and walk away from the deal entirely. The episode ends with Stan deciding he cannot bring himself to compromise. He looks directly at a producer who has chosen to gut his film for the Chinese market and says that anyone willing to do that is worthless. The episode was not subtle. Parker and Stone were not hiding what they were doing. The episode was a direct and open attack on the practice of major American entertainment companies changing their films and television shows to satisfy Chinese government censors so their content could be sold in China. This had been a documented and growing practice for years. Studios would remove characters, change plot lines, add Chinese characters into scenes, and alter endings specifically to gain approval from Chinese government reviewers who had the power to allow or block foreign films from entering the Chinese market. China had roughly 1.4 billion potential viewers. The financial pressure to satisfy its censors was enormous, and many companies had quietly chosen the money. South Park made an episode saying that choice was shameful. Then China proved the episode's point by doing exactly what the episode said companies fear: removing South Park from every platform in the country. The erasure was comprehensive in a way that was almost hard to believe. A search on Weibo, which functions similarly to Twitter and has hundreds of millions of users, returned 0 results for South Park. Not reduced results, 0. A show that had been discussed millions of times across years of posts had been scrubbed so completely that there was no trace of it in the search. Streaming services that had previously made South Park episodes available to Chinese viewers removed everything. Fan pages disappeared. Discussion threads were replaced with notices saying the content had been removed due to relevant laws and regulations. The timing of the ban placed it alongside another major story happening at the same time. The general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team had posted a message on social media expressing support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The post was brief and quickly deleted, but the response from China was immediate. Chinese broadcasters announced they would stop airing Rockets games. Chinese sponsors pulled their money from the team. The NBA, facing the potential loss of a massive and growing Chinese market, responded in a way that many people in the United States considered a surrender, with the league and the team distancing themselves from the post rather than defending the right of a team employee to express a political opinion. Parker and Stone's fake apology referenced the NBA situation directly. The line about loving money more than freedom and democracy was aimed at every American company that had made the calculation that the Chinese market was worth more than the ability to say what they actually thought. The NBA was the most visible current example when the statement was released, but the broader point applied to film studios, technology companies, and the entertainment industry as a whole. The statement ended with the question, "We good now, China?" which was not a genuine question. Parker and Stone understood perfectly well that they were not good with China and had no interest in being good with China. The statement was a public declaration that they had made the episode knowing the consequences, had received the consequences, and considered the whole situation confirmation that they had made the right call. South Park had not previously had a significant presence in China. The show had never been officially licensed for broadcast there, but it had developed an audience through streaming platforms that carried foreign content, and there was a genuine community of Chinese fans who had found the show and followed it. The ban eliminated that entirely. It also sent a signal to every other foreign content creator about what happened when you criticize the Chinese government directly and by name in a way that made the criticism unavoidable and public. Parker and Stone had clearly anticipated this outcome. The episode itself contains a scene where Stan's band is told that no matter what story they want to tell, the only film that will actually be accepted in China is something completely safe and empty. The episode treated the loss of the Chinese market as the predictable result of refusing to compromise, and treated that result as acceptable. When the ban came, it landed exactly the way the episode said it would. The episode also included a subplot that touched on a separate and serious real-world situation. Randy's time in the labor camp references the camps that the Chinese government had been operating in the Xinjiang region, where a large number of people from a minority Muslim group had been detained. Reports from journalists and human rights organizations had described conditions in these camps as severe. The episode did not go into graphic detail, but placing Randy in a labor camp alongside Winnie the Pooh was a deliberate choice to connect the fictional story to something documented and real. The Chinese government did not issue a formal statement specifically about the episode. The erasure of the show was the response. No explanation was given. No specific objections were listed. The show simply ceased to exist on Chinese platforms. This is one of the ways that Chinese internet censorship operates. Content disappears without public explanation, and the removal itself becomes the only communication. The international reaction to the ban ban was largely supportive of South Park. American media covered the story extensively. The fake apology was widely quoted and praised as exactly the kind of response the situation called for. The episode itself was viewed by many critics as one of the stronger episodes South Park had produced in its later seasons. A clear argument made through a story that worked both as entertainment and as commentary. South Park is still banned in China. The ban has not been lifted. The show has produced several more seasons since 2019, and none of that content is available in China through any official channel. The ban is permanent as far as anyone can tell, and Parker and Stone have not made any effort to reverse it. The comparison Parker and Stone made to the NBA is worth sitting with for a moment. The NBA situation and the South Park situation happened within days of each other in October 2019. One company responded to Chinese pressure by backing away from the statement that caused the pressure. The other responded by publishing a fake apology that openly mocked the entire situation and confirmed they had no regrets. Two different American institutions, two different calculations. The NBA's approach was driven by the size of its Chinese business and the financial consequences of losing it. South Park had no meaningful Chinese business to protect. Parker and Stone had nothing to lose by refusing to back down, and they used that freedom without hesitation. There is something in that comparison that the episode itself does not quite say out loud. The American companies that compromised their content for Chinese censors did so because they had built financial dependence on the Chinese market over years. South Park had never tried to enter that market. The show had never sought approval from Chinese censors. It had never made a version of itself that would be acceptable there. It had no business relationship with China that could be threatened. The freedom to make Banned in China and follow it with that fake apology existed partly because Parker and Stone had never given anyone in China anything to take away. The show that had refused to back down from Scientology, from death threats, from religious organizations across multiple countries also happened to be a show that had never tried to grow into the Chinese market. Whether that was a deliberate philosophical choice or simply a result of South Park's content making it an obvious poor fit for Chinese censorship standards from the very beginning is not something Parker and Stone have addressed directly. But the result was the same. They could say what they wanted because they had never agreed to the conditions that would require them to say something different. The China ban is the only time in South Park's history that an entire country eliminated the show rather than specific episodes. Every other major controversy produced arguments, protests, legal threats, network decisions about individual episodes. China skipped all of that and removed the whole thing. The scale of the response matched the directness of the episode that caused it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the Catholic Church's response to a later South Park episode so different from China's is the method. China had the power to make the show disappear completely within its borders and use that power immediately and silently. The Catholic Church had no such power, which meant they had to fight out in the open through letters, boycott campaigns, legal filings, and public statements. That fight lasted for months and touched multiple countries, and the show they were trying to silence kept getting more viewers every time they tried to stop it. Section 4. The Virgin Mary Battle. On December 7th, 2005, South Park aired the final episode of its 9th season. The episode was called Bloody Mary. By December 29th, Comedy Central had confirmed to the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights that there were no plans to rerun the episode. The Catholic League declared this a victory. Their president said he commended Comedy Central for finally making the right decision. Within weeks, the episode had become an international incident involving bishops, prime ministers, broadcasters, advertiser boycotts, court orders, and a legal appeal that reached a high court in New Zealand. All of this happened because of a statue. The story Parker and Stone told in Bloody Mary begins with Randy Marsh getting pulled over for drunk driving. Randy loses his license and is ordered by the court to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. At these meetings, Randy is taught that alcoholism is a disease, that he is powerless over it, and that the only path to recovery is to surrender himself to a higher power. Randy takes this completely to heart. He stops trying to control his drinking because he has been told he cannot control it. His drinking gets worse. Meanwhile, a statue of the Virgin Mary in the town of South Park begins bleeding. People gather around it. They declare it a miracle. Word spreads. The Vatican sends a cardinal to investigate. Randy, who has convinced himself that God needs to intervene to cure his disease, travels to the statue, hoping to be healed by the bleeding miracle. The joke the episode builds to involves the source of the blood. The characters initially believe it is coming from the statue's back end. The cardinal investigates closely, gets sprayed with blood, and then determines that the blood is not coming from where everyone assumed. Pope Benedict XVI arrives to make the final determination determination. He concludes that the bleeding is not a miracle because, in his words, the source of the blood is something completely ordinary. Randy is disappointed. He realizes God has not intervened. He considers giving up entirely. His son Stan follows him and argues that if God did not help him, then Randy must have stopped drinking under his own power, which means he was never as powerless as the AA meetings told him he was. The episode ends with Randy concluding that he can make his own choices, that he is not helpless, and that he can drink in moderation without surrendering control of his life to either alcohol or the idea that only a higher power can save him. The argument the episode makes about alcoholism and personal responsibility is the part Parker and Stone cared about. The Catholic imagery was the delivery method for that argument, not the point of the episode. The show had used Jesus as a regular character for 9 seasons at that point. Religious imagery was not new territory. The specific choice to use a bleeding statue of the Virgin Mary was provocative, but South Park had been provocative about religion since its first season without generating this particular kind of organized, sustained, multi-country response. The Catholic League was ready. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights is an organization based in the United States that describes itself as a defender of the civil rights of Catholics and a watchdog against anti-Catholic content in American media. On December 8, 2005, the day after Bloody Mary aired, the League's president published a statement calling the episode vile and demanding that Comedy Central apologize to Roman Catholics and permanently retire the episode so it would never air again and never be made available on DVD. The League also demanded that a specific person respond. Joseph Califano was a member of the board of directors at Viacom, the company that owned Comedy Central. He was also a practicing Catholic. The League called on Califano personally to issue his own statement of condemnation. Califano eventually released a statement calling the episode an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary, and pledged to have it reviewed by Viacom's leadership. The president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops sent a formal letter to the chief executive of Viacom directly, writing that the network had shown extreme insensitivity by airing the episode. Comedy Central quietly removed Bloody Mary from the rerun schedule. When the network aired all of the season 9 episodes again in late December 2005, Bloody Mary was absent. The network responded to viewers who wrote in asking about the episode by assuring them the episode had not been retired and would remain on the DVD release of season 9. But in practice, the episode was gone from television. Screenshots from the episode were removed from Comedy Central's own website. The episode disappeared from the South Park section of the network's online presence. The Catholic League announced this as a significant win. Their public statement from December 30th described the outcome as another major victory. Then the story crossed the Pacific. In New Zealand, a broadcaster called C4 had scheduled Bloody Mary for a February 2006 airing. The New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference contacted the media company that owned C4, a company called CanWest, and asked them not to air the episode. They were joined in this request by the Council of Christians and Muslims and other religious organizations. The coalition argued the episode was deeply offensive to Catholic believers and should not be broadcast. CanWest rejected the request. The network said the episode would air as planned. The bishops escalated. Leading Catholic figures in New Zealand called for a boycott of C4 and its sister channel TV3. They encouraged Catholics across the country to stop watching both channels and to pressure advertisers to pull their money from the network. CanWest did not back down. Instead, the network moved the episode's broadcast date earlier than originally planned, specifically to take advantage of the attention the campaign was generating. The controversy was bringing the episode more publicity than it would have received if nobody had objected, and the network decided to broadcast into that attention rather than away from it. New Zealand's Prime Minister at the time, Helen Clark, was asked about the situation publicly. She issued a statement saying the episode sounded revolting to her personally. She also said the network was free to air it. A sitting head of government described a South Park episode as revolting and then declined to do anything about it. One advertiser withdrew their ads from CanWest's channels over the episode. A Catholic organization called Family Life International created a website for organizing a broader advertiser boycott. A separate company called C4 Productions, which had no connection to the C4 television channel but shared its name, applied to a court for an emergency order to stop the episode from airing the night before its broadcast. The company argued that people would confuse their business with the channel airing the episode and that this confusion would damage them. The judge rejected the application. Bloody Mary aired in New Zealand on February 22, 2006. The audience for that broadcast was approximately 210,000 people. South Park's normal audience on C4 was approximately 35,000 people. The boycott campaign and the weeks of controversy had delivered 6 times the usual number of viewers to the episode the campaign was trying to suppress. Outside the C4 studio on the night of the broadcast, approximately nearly 400 Catholics gathered to pray and sing. They did not block the broadcast. The episode aired as scheduled while they stood outside. The Catholic Church in New Zealand formally complained to the country's Broadcasting Standards Authority, which is the government body responsible for reviewing whether television content violates broadcasting rules. Dozens of individual complaints were also filed. The authority reviewed everything and in June 2006 rejected all of the complaints. The ruling stated that the episode was of such a farcical, absurd, and unrealistic nature that it did not breach standards of good taste and decency in the context in which it was offered. The authority also noted that showing disrespect for something does not automatically constitute the kind of harmful content that broadcasting rules are designed to prevent. The Catholic bishops decided to appeal the ruling to the High Court in Wellington. Their lawyers appeared before the court and described the episode as tasteless, crass, and ugly. They argued that the Broadcasting Standards Authority had made the wrong decision and that the episode should have been found to violate broadcasting rules. The appeal did not succeed. In Australia, the situation played out slightly differently. The Australian broadcaster SBS had been considering airing the episode. An archbishop in Melbourne named Dennis Hart wrote to SBS asking them not to broadcast it. The network's programming leadership initially rejected the request. Then, citing the surrounding controversy, including the publication of the Danish Muhammad cartoons around the same time, which had created a broader global conversation about the limits of satire targeting religious subjects, SBS decided to postpone rather than cancel the episode. Bloody Mary did not air on SBS in Australia until 2016, 10 years after the controversy. When it finally aired, it did so on a secondary channel called SBS Viceland. Russia declined to air the episode. Several other countries also declined. In the United States, Comedy Central's position throughout was somewhat inconsistent. The network assured viewers the episode had not been retired and would remain on DVD. It also removed the episode from its rerun schedule and scrubbed it from its own website. The episode eventually returned to the regular rotation in August 2006, roughly 8 months after the initial broadcast. It has continued to air since then and currently remains available for streaming, making it unique among the South Park episodes that generated major religious controversy. Unlike the Muhammad episodes, which remain permanently unavailable, Bloody Mary can still be watched legally. The Catholic League's president described their campaign as a success at various points, citing the initial removal from the rerun schedule as evidence that organized pressure had produced results. Comedy Central's spokesperson maintained that the network's decisions about the episode's scheduling were unrelated to any external pressure. Both of these things cannot be entirely true at the same time. What the Bloody Mary controversy demonstrated, separate from any argument about whether Comedy Central acted appropriately, was a specific pattern in how organized religious pressure operated against South Park. The pattern involved formal letters to corporate leadership, calls for personal statements from individual board members, advertiser pressure campaigns, legal filings, appeals to government bodies, and public demonstrations. The campaign against Bloody Mary used every single one of these tools across multiple countries simultaneously. The result of all this was that the episode was delayed or blocked in several countries, temporarily removed from American reruns, and stripped from Comedy Central's online presence for a period of months. A sitting prime minister described it as revolting. A Viacom board member condemned it publicly. The bishops of multiple countries filed formal complaints with broadcasting authorities. Courts in New Zealand heard legal arguments about it. All of this happened because of a 22-minute animated episode about Randy Marsh's drinking problem. The episode's actual argument, that personal responsibility is more useful than surrendering to the idea that you are powerless, was largely absent from the public conversation. The debate that consumed months of real-world attention focused almost entirely on the visual depiction of the statue and what that depiction meant to Catholic believers. The AA critique at the center of the story was not what the Catholic League was objecting to. The statue was. Parker and Stone have not commented extensively on the Bloody Mary controversy specifically. The episode has continued to exist in the show's library. It did not get the permanent ban treatment that the Muhammad episodes received. The Catholic Church had a great deal of power to create noise, organize campaigns, file legal complaints, and pressure advertisers. It did not have the power to make the episode disappear, the way that death threats made episodes 200 and 201 disappear. The tools available to a religious organization operating through legal and public channels produced a different outcome than a direct threat to human life. South Park did not make a follow-up episode responding to the Bloody Mary controversy directly the way it responded to the Muhammad censorship through Cartoon Wars and later through 200 and 201. The show absorbed the fight, the episode returned to air, and the story moved on. Before we move on, if you're you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the fight over Bloody Mary was not the most personal scandal the show ever produced from within its own cast and story. The most quietly devastating one, the one where a joke the show had been making for 20 years turned out to be something the show itself had to answer for, started with a name that everyone assumed they knew how to spell. Section 5. The retcon. For 20 years, South Park had a black character named Token Black. The name was not subtle. The show never pretended it was subtle. Token Black was the only black child in the town of South Park, and he had been given a name that was a direct reference to the practice of including a single non-white character in a television show purely to avoid looking like the entire cast was one race. That practice had a name in the entertainment industry: tokenism, and South Park had named its only recurring black character after it. The joke was in plain sight from the moment the character first spoke in season 3. For 2 decades, the show kept making it. Then, in February of 2022, South Park aired the second episode of its 25th season. The episode was called The Big Fix. By the time the episode ended, Token Black no longer existed. His name had always been Tolkien. Everyone in South Park had always known this. The only people who had ever thought his name was Token were Stan Marsh, Randy Marsh, and the audience watching at home. And according to a doctor who broke the fourth wall and spoke directly into the camera, those people were the problem. What Parker and Stone did with that episode and what they did to the show's entire archive in the weeks that followed is one of the strangest and most committed moves in South Park's history. To understand the full scale of it, the episode needs to be followed from beginning to end, and then the aftermath needs to be tracked across everything the show had ever made. The Big Fix begins with Randy Marsh realizing that his family has no black friends. This realization lands on him with the full weight of personal guilt. He invites his son Stan's classmate and his family over for dinner specifically to address this gap. At dinner, Randy and Stan learn something that stops Stan completely. His friend's name is not Token. His name is Tolkien, spelled exactly like the name of J.R.R. Tolkien, the English author who wrote The Lord of the Rings. He was named after the writer because his parents loved the books. Stan is the only person in the room who did not know this. He is also, it becomes clear, the only person in his entire school who did not know this. Cartman knew. He had seen the name written down and had been confused about the spelling, but he had known the name was a reference to the author. Every other student knew. Every teacher knew. Every adult in South Park knew. Only Stan and Randy had ever looked at a black child named Tolkien and assumed his name must be Token because of course it must be. The show does not play this gently. Stan's realization that he has spent his entire friendship with Tolkien calling him by a name rooted in a racial stereotype without ever questioning it, without it ever occurring to him to check, without Tolkien apparently ever correcting him, sends Stan into a spiral. He goes to a doctor. He sits in an office and explains what he has just learned about himself. He is frightened by what it reveals about his own assumptions. He is ashamed that it took this long. The doctor listens. Then the doctor turns away from Stan and looks directly into the camera. He addresses the audience watching. He asks, slowly and deliberately, whether anyone else had also thought the name was Token. He pauses. He asks again. He says that if anyone watching had also assumed the name was Token rather than Tolkien, that was disgusting, and they were the problem. At the end of the episode, the doctor delivers a second message to the audience through a public service announcement. He says that many people suffer from hidden assumptions they do not examine. He provides a phone number for people who thought the name was Token to call. The number is followed by an extended insult directed at those callers. The joke works because it is genuinely two things at once. On one level, it is absurd. The idea that a character the show itself named Token has secretly always been named Tolkien is a fiction so obvious that pointing it out is part of the gag. On another level, the joke is entirely serious because the show is acknowledging that naming its only black character Token was something that deserved to be acknowledged, and the method of acknowledgement is to make the audience feel what Stan feels, the quiet embarrassment of realizing you accepted something without examining it. Parker and Stone did not stop at the episode itself. What happened to the show's archive after The Big Fix aired was where the commitment became extraordinary. Every episode of South Park that had ever existed was updated. Every subtitle, every closed caption, every piece of written text in the show's back catalog that had previously displayed the name Token was changed to Tolkien. This was not a small task. The character had appeared across more than 2 decades of television. His name appeared in dialogue descriptions, in episode recaps, in the text overlays that subtitling systems use to help viewers follow the show. Every single instance was found and changed. There was one specific exception built into the retcon. In episodes where Stan or Randy speak Tolkien's name, the subtitle still displays Token. This is because the episode established that Stan and Randy were the only people who never knew the real name. Their dialogue represents their ignorance. Everyone else's dialogue in every other episode across the entire archive now reads Tolkien, as though it always did. The effect of this on viewers who came to the show after The Big Fix aired was precise and deliberate. A new viewer watching the series from the beginning would see every character except Stan and Randy using the name Tolkien throughout. They would have no reason to believe the name had ever been anything else. The retcon is comprehensive enough that the fiction the episode creates, that his name was always Tolkien and only two people failed to notice, holds up completely if you are watching without the prior context. For longtime viewers, the experience was something different. People who had watched South Park for years went back to check old episodes and found the subtitles already changed. The name they remembered seeing displayed for 20 years was gone. Some viewers watching with subtitles had the experience of hearing what sounded like Token in the audio while reading Tolkien in the text, because the audio in older episodes had not been re-recorded. Only the written text was changed. The gap between what they heard and what they read was its own quiet confirmation that something unusual had been done. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Parker and Stone went further than simply changing the name in the archive. Tolkien's Wikipedia page was updated. The official South Park website reflected. Section 6, The N-Word Episode. On March 7th, 2007, South Park aired the first episode of its 11th season. The episode was called With Apologies to Jesse Jackson. In it, Randy Marsh says the N-word on live national television in front of millions of people. He says it clearly, loudly, on a real game show in front of a studio audience. The camera cuts to the faces of the black members of the audience. The game show host goes silent. Randy's family, watching from the crowd, looks like they want to disappear through the floor. Over the course of the next 22 minutes, the word is spoken a total of 42 times. Every time, it is completely uncensored. No bleep, no muting, no pause or cut around it. The word goes out over basic cable television in full 42 times in an episode that also features Jesse Jackson accepting a literal on-screen apology by having Randy kiss his backside while a photograph is taken for the newspapers. The NAACP praised the episode. There was almost no mainstream controversy. The episode generated less public outrage than almost anything else South Park had produced in its first 10 seasons. That gap between what the episode contains and how little reaction it produced is the story, because the absence of scandal here says something about the episode that the episode itself was trying to say. To understand how the episode came to exist, the Michael Richards incident needs to be understood first. Richards was an actor best known for playing Kramer on the long-running television comedy Seinfeld. In November 2006, Richards was performing a stand-up comedy set at a venue in Los Angeles called The Laugh Factory when two black men in the audience began heckling him. Richards' response was to scream the N-word at them, repeatedly and with clear hostility in front of a room full of people. Someone in the audience filmed it. The video spread immediately. The fallout was enormous and fast. Richards appeared on television within days to apologize. He chose to deliver that apology on a program hosted by Jesse Jackson, the civil rights leader and political figure who had spent decades positioning himself as a spokesperson and representative for black Americans in moments of racial crisis. Richards sat across from Jackson and expressed remorse. Jackson accepted the apology on behalf of, as he framed it, the community that had been harmed. Parker and Stone watched this unfold and found themselves bothered by something specific. Not Richards' behavior at the Laugh Factory, which they found straightforwardly terrible. What bothered them was the apology. Specifically, that Richards had chosen to apologize to Jesse Jackson rather than to the two men he had actually attacked with the word in that room. And even more specifically, that Jackson had accepted the apology as though he held the authority to receive it on behalf of every black person in America. Staff writer Vernon Chapman, who worked on the episode and is himself of mixed race, was particularly focused on this. The idea that Jesse Jackson was positioned as the emperor of black people, the single figure to whom white people could deliver racial apologies and consider the matter resolved, struck Chapman and the rest of the writing team as a distortion of how race and accountability actually work. The line that became the episode's most quoted moment, "Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people," came directly from that frustration. Parker and Stone had also been thinking thinking for some time about an episode that engaged directly with the word itself. They had wanted to make this episode for years before the Richards incident gave them the structure they needed. The first scene, in which Randy blurts out the word on Wheel of Fortune, was the idea that had existed the longest. Parker later said it was one of his favorite things the show had ever done. For a long time, that single scene had been the only idea they had for the episode, and they had not been able to build a full story around it. The Richards aftermath gave them the rest. The Wheel of Fortune scene works because of its specific mechanics. Randy has made it to the bonus round. He has been given the category People Who Annoy You and a set of letters. He works through the puzzle methodically. He asks for additional letters. The remaining blank slowly becomes obvious to everyone watching, both in the studio audience on screen and at home. Randy hesitates. He is visibly uncertain whether he should say what he thinks the answer is. He says it anyway. The answer on the board is N-jiggers. Randy has solved the puzzle correctly. The studio falls silent. The camera holds on the faces of black audience members, then on Randy's family. Nobody moves. Then the show cuts to the town of South Park, where everyone has seen it happen. What makes the scene land the way it does is that Randy is not racist in the moment he says the word. He is not attacking anyone. He is not using the word as a weapon. He is a man on a game show who has worked out a puzzle and said the answer out loud without thinking through what saying it in that context would mean. The show is precise about this distinction, and it holds on to that distinction throughout the episode without letting Randy off the hook for the consequences. Stan goes to school the next day already knowing what happened. He goes to find Tolkien, expecting that the situation will require some kind of acknowledgement. Cartman immediately tries to turn the moment into a race war, announcing loudly that everything is about to escalate. Tolkien does not escalate. He tells Stan that Stan does not understand what it feels like when that word comes out. He does not fight. He walks away. Cartman, who had been preparing for conflict, announces that Tolkien has forfeited the race war, and therefore Stan and people of his background have won by default, and runs away screaming. Randy, desperate to resolve the situation, goes to Jesse Jackson. What follows is one of the most deliberately uncomfortable scenes the show ever constructed. Jackson tells Randy that an apology can be delivered and accepted in a very specific physical way. Randy complies. A photograph is taken. The photograph appears in the newspapers. Randy considers himself forgiven. He goes back to Stan, assuming everything is resolved. Stan tells Tolkien that his dad apologized to Jesse Jackson. Tolkien stares at him. Stan says that Jesse Jackson said everything is okay now. Tolkien says, Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people. Stan, completely baffled, says, he told my dad he was. The exchange is the center of everything the episode is doing. Stan has gone through the approved public ritual for racial apology, find the recognized authority figure, perform the contrition, receive the absolution, and cannot understand why Tolkien is still upset. Tolkien is still upset because the apology was not made to him. Randy did not go to Tolkien. Randy did not go to any of the actual people in his actual life who were affected by what he said. He went to a famous man on television who accepted forgiveness on behalf of a group of people he does not represent. And now Randy thinks the matter is closed. Tolkien's anger is not resolved by the Jesse Jackson scene. That is the point. The public performance of apology and the actual experience of being on the receiving end of racial harm are two completely different things, and the episode refuses to let them collapse into each other. Meanwhile, the school has brought in a guest speaker named Dr. David Nelson to give the students a sensitivity seminar. Nelson is a little person. From the moment he walks onto the stage, Cartman cannot stop laughing. Not an angry laugh, not a cruel, calculated laugh in the way Cartman is sometimes cruel. A completely uncontrollable, helpless, falling out of his chair, unable to form words laugh that he cannot stop no matter what anyone says or does. Principal Victoria shouts at him. Dr. Nelson tells him his words do not hurt. Cartman keeps laughing until he literally falls off his chair. The subplot mirrors the main story in a specific way. Cartman's reaction to Nelson is not something Nelson can resolve through a sensitivity seminar, because the seminar is built on the assumption that once people understand why their behavior is hurtful, they will change it. Cartman is not changed by understanding. He understands perfectly well. The tool the school has brought in to address his behavior is not capable of addressing his behavior. The episode places this next to Randy's Jesse Jackson apology to make the same point twice. The official responses people reach for when confronted with prejudice often have very little to do with the actual experience of the people being harmed. Doctor. Nelson eventually challenges Cartman physically, trying to prove that Cartman's laughter does not bother him. The fight that follows ends with Nelson pinning Cartman, declaring that he has proved his point, and then landing an additional hit on Cartman from behind as he walks away. Cartman, completely unaffected, keeps laughing. The fight proved nothing. The seminar resolved nothing. The administration congratulates itself anyway. Back in the Randy story, the public has turned against him. He is now known everywhere as the N-word guy. People shouted at him in the street. He cannot go to stores without being confronted. A group of people chases him. He tries to reclaim the label through a spoken word performance, which fails completely. He has become defined by the single worst moment of a television appearance, and no amount of Jesse Jackson's formal absolution changes how the people around him see him. The episode was written with specific knowledge of how the Richards situation had played out in public. The comedy club Randy ends up at is called the Laugh Factory, the same name as the real venue where Richards had his breakdown. Michael Richards himself appears in the episode. So does Mark Furman, the police officer whose recorded use of the N-word during the O.J. Simpson trial had made him one of the most publicly condemned figures associated with the word in the prior decade. Both of them try to help Randy, which does not help. The resolution of Stan's story is the quietest moment in the episode. Stan goes back to Tolkien a final time. He does not try to fix anything. He does not offer another apology. He tells Tolkien that he does not understand what it feels like. He says he never will understand because he is not black and has never experienced what Tolkien has experienced. He sits with that fact rather than trying to move past it. Tolkien tells him that the acknowledgement that Stan cannot fully understand, is what he was looking for. Not a performance of understanding, not a Jesse Jackson absolution, just honesty about the limits of what one person can know about another person's experience. The episode used the N-word 42 times and generated almost no significant public anger. The NAACP issued a statement calling it a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words and their impact on people. Several critics called it one of the sharper pieces of social commentary the show had ever produced. Parker and Stone did not credit the lack of controversy to careful handling of the material. The episode is as blunt and direct as anything South Park had ever made. The word is not softened. The subject is not approached gingerly. The comedy comes from the same place most South Park comedy comes from the distance between what people say they believe and how they actually behave when tested by real circumstances. What the episode found, and what the lack of scandal confirmed, was that an audience that understood what the show was doing with the material had no reason to object to it. The N-word, and with apologies to Jesse Jackson, is not being used to harm anyone. It is being used to examine harm. The harm of the word itself. The harm of empty apology rituals. The harm of assuming that public figures can stand in for real people in real relationships. An episode that could have been the most controversial thing South Park ever aired turned out to be one of the most praised because the argument the episode was making was clear enough that there was nothing to fight about. South Park would not always be so lucky in threading that particular needle. The show's most deeply personal internal controversy, the one that forced Parker and Stone to look back at a character they had created and acknowledge that something about him needed to change, would take 20 more years to arrive. And when it did arrive, the response was not praise from an advocacy group, but a doctor staring into a camera and telling the audience, slowly and without any warmth, that they were the problem. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before that retcon, and before this episode, there was one South Park scandal that produced almost no external controversy at all. Not because the episode was careful, but because what it showed was so genuinely disturbing that the audience did not know whether they were supposed to laugh or be frightened. A child made two parents into chili and fed them to their own son. Radiohead showed up, and somehow the episode became the highest rated in the show's entire history. Section 7, Cartman's darkest moment. There is a moment near the end of Scott Tenorman Must Die where Stan Marsh turns to Kyle Broflovsky and says they should probably never make Cartman that angry again. Kyle agrees. The two of them stand in the background watching a 9-year-old boy lick tears off the face of a teenager who has just realized he ate his own parents. Stan and Kyle are not laughing. They are watching with the specific expression of people who have just understood something about the person standing next to them that they cannot understand. The episode aired on July 11th, 2001. Parker and Stone have described it as the most important episode in the show's history up to that point. Not the funniest, not the most controversial in the traditional sense, the most important, because of what it did to one specific character and what that change meant for everything South Park would become afterward. Before Scott Tenorman Must Die, Eric Cartman was a particular kind of character. He was a spoiled, manipulative, self-centered child who threw tantrums when he did not get what he wanted and held prejudiced views that the show used as a vehicle for satire. He was unpleasant in ways that were meant to be funny. He was not threatening. He was not someone a viewer would look at and feel genuinely uneasy about. He was a cartoon brat in a cartoon town, and his awfulness was the comfortable, manageable kind. After Scott Tenorman Must Die, none of that was true anymore. The episode begins with Cartman boasting to Stan, Kyle, and Kenny that he has reached puberty before any of them. He has pubic hair. This is proof in his mind that he is more mature and more advanced than his friends. The other boys immediately explain to him that pubic hair is something that grows naturally, and that buying someone else's is not the same thing. Cartman has paid a high school student named Scott Tenorman $10 for a handful of hair from Scott's body. He has been completely and thoroughly fooled. Cartman goes to Scott to demand his money back. Scott refuses. This is where the episode's engine starts running. Cartman tries several approaches to recover the $10. Every single one fails. Scott is smarter, faster, and older than Cartman, and he turns each of Cartman's plans back on him in a way that makes Cartman look worse each time. Scott tricks Cartman out of an additional $6.12. He engineers a situation where Cartman travels all the way to a neighboring city based on a fake event that does not exist. He records Cartman on video performing a humiliating dance in exchange for a promise to return the money, then burns the money in front of him instead. The video gets shown to the entire town. Everyone in South Park watches Cartman dance like a pig, begging for his money back, and they all laugh. Kenny dies from laughing too hard. Cartman's humiliation is total and public. He has lost $16.12 and his dignity in front of everyone he knows. This is when the episode changes. Up to this point, the show has been playing Cartman's failures for comedy in the way it always had. Cartman losing is funny. Cartman being outsmarted is funny. The audience has been watching with the comfortable expectation that the episode will resolve the way South Park episodes usually resolve, with some lesson about Cartman's behavior or a final gag at his expense. Instead, Cartman goes quiet. He starts drawing plans at his desk with total concentration. He works through diagrams and calculations with the focused intensity of someone who has made a decision and is now only thinking about execution. The camera holds on him working. He is not throwing a tantrum. He is not complaining. He is planning something, and the episode lets that fact sit without explanation. Cartman's first stated revenge plan involves training a pony owned by a local farmer named Mr. Denkins to bite Scott's private parts off at a public event. He tells Stan and Kyle about this plan. He also tells them that Scott's favorite band is the English rock group Radiohead, and that his secondary plan involves getting Radiohead to publicly mock Scott. Stan and Kyle are horrified by both of these plans and agree to warn Scott. This is exactly what Cartman expected them to do. The public event Cartman organizes is called a Chili Con Carnival. It is a chili cook-off where townspeople bring their best chili to be judged. Scott arrives expecting the pony to attack him, prepared to stop it. He is also expecting Cartman's chili to contain something awful based on what Stan and Kyle told him. He switches the bowls before anyone notices, making Cartman eat what he thinks is Scott's chili, while Scott eats what he thinks is Cartman's chili. Radiohead arrives at the carnival. They are there because Cartman sent them a letter claiming Scott was a young boy dying of cancer who had one final wish to meet the band. Tom York, Johnny Greenwood, Colin Greenwood, Ed O'Brien, and Phil Selway all provided their actual voices for the episode. Every member of Radiohead appears in Scott Tenorman Must Die playing a version of themselves. Scott is eating his chili. He finishes most of it. He tells Cartman that whatever he was planning has failed. He prepares to reveal what was in the chili Cartman just ate. Cartman stops him. He explains that he already knew about the switch. He switched the bowls himself, in advance, knowing that Scott would switch them again. The chili Scott has been eating is not Chef's, it is Cartman's. And Cartman's chili has a special ingredient. What follows is one of the most carefully constructed reveals in the show's history. Cartman explains step by step what he actually did. He discovered that the pony was on Denkins's property. He arranged for Stan and Kyle to warn Scott about the pony, knowing this would cause Scott to go to Denkins' farm to move the pony away from the carnival. He made sure that while Scott was on Denkins' property without permission, Denkins would be there with a shotgun. Denkins shot Scott's parents for trespassing while he was giving his report to the police officer on the scene. While Denkins was occupied, Cartman stole the bodies. He spent a night with a hacksaw. He made a chili. Scott reaches into the bowl. He finds his mother's wedding ring, still on her finger. The studio audience on Wheel of Fortune falls silent in the previous episode's cold open, and a similar silence descends over anyone watching Scott Tenorman Must Die at this moment. Scott begins to cry. He begins to cry in the specific way that a person cries when something has happened that cannot be fixed and cannot be taken back. When the loss is so sudden and so complete that the body does not know what to do except collapse. Radiohead, who have been standing nearby and are completely unaware of what just happened, look over at Scott. They see a teenage boy crying at a food festival. They respond the way the letter Cartman sent suggested they might respond to a scene where someone is being uncool. Tom York tells Scott that everyone has problems and that crying about them is not the answer. The other members agree. They call him a little crybaby and leave. Cartman walks over to Scott. He leans down close to Scott's face. He says he wants to taste the tears of unfathomable sadness. He licks them directly off Scott's cheeks. He says they are yummy and sweet. Stan and Kyle stand in the back of the crowd watching. Stan says, "Jesus Christ." Kyle says nothing. Then Kyle says they should probably never make Cartman this angry again. Stan agrees. The episode ends with Cartman delivering his line from the Looney Tunes cartoons, the one Porky Pig uses at the end of each short, delivered by Cartman with complete satisfaction. Parker and Stone said this episode changed what Cartman was in a way that everything afterward had to account for. Before Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman's cruelty had limits that the audience could sense without being told. After the episode, those limits were gone. The audience now knew there were no limits. Whatever Cartman did in future episodes would be measured against what he had done to Scott Tenorman, and the comparison would always be available. Matt Stone described the episode as taking Cartman from a kinda little shithead to probably the most evil kid in the world. This was not said with regret. The show needed Cartman to be this person. Without this episode, the next decade of Cartman stories could not exist in the form they took. His later schemes, his later manipulations, his later moments of genuine ugliness all draw from the well that Scott Tenorman Must Die dug. The episode is the foundation. The controversy attached to Scott Tenorman Must Die operated differently from every other scandal on this list. No organization filed a complaint. No network pulled the episode. No bishop wrote a letter. No government official issued a statement. The episode aired, it finished, and it became immediately and permanently embedded in the culture of the show and in the broader culture around it. The reason no external controversy attached to the episode is worth thinking about carefully. The content of the episode is genuinely extreme. Two parents are murdered and turned into food that is fed to their own child. This is presented as the punchline to a revenge plot carried out by a fourth grader over $16. The episode does not punish Cartman. The episode does not suggest he did something wrong. Stan and Kyle are horrified, but their horror is framed as a recognition of Cartman's power rather than as a moral judgment that the audience is meant to share. Cartman wins completely. No advocacy group knew how to respond to this. The episode was not attacking a religion. It was not using a slur. It was not depicting a real person in a compromising situation. It was a story about a child committing a crime that would, in real life, result in multiple life sentences, played as the triumphant conclusion of a comedy episode about pubic hair, and the show treated both the horror and the comedy as equally valid responses from the audience. Rolling Stone later listed Cartman feeding Scott his own parents as the second greatest moment in the show's entire history. The magazine described the episode as the perfect combination of the show's ability to be both shocking and brilliant at the same time. South Park's fan community consistently votes Scott Tenorman Must Die among the 2 or 3 best episodes the show has ever produced. In a 2011 fan vote conducted under a promotion the show called Year of the Fan, the episode placed second out of the entire catalog. On the Internet Movie Database, which collects audience ratings for films and television episodes, Scott Tenorman Must Die has the highest user rating of any South Park episode ever made. It also holds one of the highest user ratings of any individual television episode across any show in the database. Parker and Stone chose the episode as one of their personal favorites in both 2003 and again in 2006. The animation director who worked on it, Eric Stowe, directed the episode itself. The pubic hairs visible in the episode's opening were scanned from actual hairs taken from the back of the neck of Adrian Beard, who serves as the show's lead storyboard artist and has voiced Tolkien since season 4. The production detail is mentioned in the episode's background materials as a point of specific and deliberate commitment to the reality of the joke. The members of Radiohead Radiohead agreed to appear in the episode and recorded their own voices for it. How exactly Parker and Stone convinced one of the most critically respected rock bands in the world to participate in an episode about a child murdering 2 people and serving them as chili is something the show's production history touches on only briefly. The band was approached, they agreed, and they showed up. Tom York's delivery of the lines mocking a grieving teenager for crying delivered with complete sincerity, as though Radiohead genuinely believes Scott is just being overdramatic, is one of the most precisely timed pieces of voice work in the episode. The episode's legacy inside the show's own mythology stretched forward for 13 years. In episode 201, aired in 2010, Scott Tenorman returns as the leader of the Ginger Separatist movement. His return brings with it a revelation that reframes everything that happened in Scott Tenorman Must Die in a way that makes the original episode even darker. It is revealed that Scott, in researching his revenge on Cartman years earlier, had discovered that his father, Jack Tenorman, had fathered a child with Cartman's mother. Jack Tenorman was Cartman's biological father. Scott Tenorman is Cartman's half-brother. This means that the parents Cartman had killed and turned into chili were not just Scott's parents, they were also Cartman's own parents. Cartman murdered his own father and fed him to his half-brother, and then licked the resulting tears off that half-brother's face. The show retroactively turned the episode's already extreme content into something several layers darker, and did so 9 years after the original aired, in an episode already dealing with death threats and censorship and the most serious controversy in the show's history. The fact that Scott Tenorman Must Die produced no external scandal and became the most beloved episode in the show's archive while containing content more genuinely extreme than several episodes that were formally banned and legally challenged is one of the more honest things South Park has ever revealed about the relationship between content and outrage. The Catholic Church mobilized multiple countries over a statue. Nobody mobilized over a child turning his own father into chili. The difference was not in the content. The difference was in whether anyone with organized power recognized themselves in what the show was doing. Scott Tenorman did not belong to any group that could file a formal complaint. His parents were fictional, the harm was fictional, and the execution was so specific, so detailed, so clearly the product of genuine creative commitment rather than lazy provocation that the audience's response was not outrage, but something closer to awe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show that could do Scott Tenorman Must Die without consequence would 7 weeks later do something far simpler. Show a dead celebrity at a Halloween party with a stingray sticking out of his chest, and find itself in a genuine public storm that reached the widow of the man being depicted and made international news. The scale of what causes a South Park scandal has never followed a logical line. What gets the show into real trouble is rarely the darkest thing it has ever done. Section 8. Too soon. Steve Irwin died on September 4th, 2006. He was 44 years old. He was underwater off the coast of Queensland, Australia, filming footage for a documentary about ocean creatures when a stingray passed beneath him. The barb on the stingray's tail struck him in the chest and pierced his heart. He died at the scene. His cameraman was with him and witnessed it happen. The footage existed but was never released publicly, and Irwin's family later had it destroyed. The news spread around the world within hours. Irwin had built one of the most recognizable public personalities in television over the previous decade through his wildlife program, The Crocodile Hunter. He was famous for getting physically close to dangerous animals, handling them with his bare hands, speaking to the camera about them with a level of genuine enthusiasm that did not read as performance. He seemed to actually love every creature he worked with, including the ones that could kill him. Audiences responded to that authenticity across more than 100 countries where the show aired. He was not simply a television host. He was, to a significant portion of the global viewing public, a genuinely beloved figure. His death was a shock in the specific way that the deaths of people who seem indestructible are always shocks. Irwin had spent years on television doing things that looked extraordinarily dangerous and walking away from all of them. The idea that a stingray, not a crocodile, not a venomous snake, not any of the animals he was most associated with, but a stingray, had killed him while he was swimming had a quality that felt almost impossible. The whole world seemed to pause for a moment. 7 weeks later, South Park aired an episode called Hell on Earth 2006. The episode is primarily a Halloween special. The main plot follows Satan planning a massive costume party at a hotel in Los Angeles. Satan wants the party to be perfect. He becomes obsessed with every detail, micromanaging the decorations, the guest list, the cake, the music, in a way that the episode compares to the television show My Super Sweet 16, a real program on the channel MTV in which wealthy teenagers throw extravagant birthday parties and behave badly when any detail falls short of their expectations. Satan, the ruler of hell, has become as demanding and difficult as a spoiled teenage girl planning a party. This is the joke the episode is built around. A separate subplot involves the boys summoning the ghost of the rapper Biggie Smalls through a mirror ritual. Another subplot involves 3 of history's most notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy, being tasked with picking up the enormous Ferrari-shaped cake Satan has ordered for the party. The 3 of them are played as a version of the Three Stooges, getting into physical comedy mishaps while trying to transport the cake across Los Angeles. The Steve Irwin moment is not the main story. It is not even a subplot. It is a single scene, brief enough to measure in seconds, that arrives in the middle of the episode without extended setup and ends without extended resolution. Satan is at his party. One of his guests approaches him and reports that someone at the party is wearing an offensive costume. The costume in question is a Steve Irwin outfit, khaki shirt, khaki shorts, with a stingray attached to the chest. Satan goes to confront the guest wearing the costume. He approaches the figure and begins to explain why the costume is in poor taste. Steve Irwin died very recently, Satan says. Wearing his likeness at a party with a stingray in his chest is disrespectful and insensitive, and Satan will not have it at his event. He is firm about this. He tells the figure in the costume to remove it or leave. The figure responds. He explains to Satan that he is not someone wearing a costume. He is Steve Irwin. He is there as himself, as a genuine guest of the party, because he is dead, and this is Hell's Halloween celebration. Satan looks at him. Satan realizes that Steve Irwin has arrived at the party without a costume. Everyone else is dressed up. Steve Irwin has arrived in his regular clothes with a stingray in his chest, which is simply what he looks like now because of how he died. Satan tells him he cannot stay at the party because not wearing a costume at a costume party is also unacceptable. Satan kicks him out. Steve Irwin argues briefly that Satan is being unfair, noting that they are supposedly friends. Satan holds firm. Irwin leaves. The episode moves on. The entire sequence lasts approximately 30 seconds. It generates its humor from the specific structure of the joke. Satan himself considers the Steve Irwin costume offensive and enforces a standard of decency about it, only to discover that the problem cannot be resolved because the deceased man has no costume to remove. The show builds in its own acknowledgement that the depiction is too soon by having Satan be the one to say so. Then it does the depiction anyway. Parker and Stone have said they were surprised by the controversy that followed. Their position, expressed through Comedy Central's spokesperson in the immediate aftermath, was that South Park had featured far more extreme material than a brief gag about a celebrity's death, and that regular viewers of the show would not be shocked by it. A spokesperson for the network said South Park had offended people before and probably would again, and that regular viewers would not find this particular moment uniquely surprising. The response from people connected to Irwin told a different story. A friend of Irwin's wife Terry, speaking anonymously to press outlets, said that Terry Irwin was devastated that her husband was being mocked in what she saw as a cruel way. Steve Irwin had died 7 weeks earlier. His wife was still in the earliest period of grief. His 2 children, a daughter named Bindi, who was 8 years old at the time, and a son named Robert, who was 2, had lost their father less than 2 months before the episode aired. The family was still in the immediate aftermath of one of the worst things that can happen to a person, and a cartoon on American television had used the specific manner of their loved one's death as a visual gag. Irwin's colleague and friend Mark Amy spoke publicly and more directly. Amy called the episode distasteful and used language that made clear he found the decision to include the scene genuinely offensive rather than edgy or brave. He was not filing a legal complaint. He was not organizing a boycott. He was a person who had known and worked with Steve Irwin and who was expressing simply and plainly that this particular joke had been made too soon and at the expense of real people who were still in pain. Australia's television regulatory body, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, announced that the episode would be broadcast on the Australian network SBS, but that the broadcast would be delayed by 12 months because of programming considerations. The regulatory body was careful to say that the delay was not a ban, and that the episode would eventually air. It did eventually air in Australia, though it arrived there a full year after its original American broadcast. The episode did not generate formal legal challenges of the kind that the Catholic Church mounted against Bloody Mary. There was no coalition of organizations sending letters to Viacom. There was no New Zealand Prime Minister issuing a statement. There were no court filings or regulatory complaints of the scale that had surrounded earlier South Park controversies. What there was instead was something smaller and in some ways harder to dismiss: the genuine distress of a grieving widow and the people who loved her husband, expressed publicly and without any apparent strategic calculation. Comedy Central defended the episode. Parker and Stone stood behind the episode. The episode was not pulled from the schedule. It aired in the United States as planned on October 25, 2006, and it continued to rerun afterward without restriction. What made the Steve Irwin controversy different from nearly every other South Park scandal is the question of timing. The show had made jokes about dead celebrities before. It had put deceased figures in hell on multiple occasions. The character of Satan had hosted parties in earlier episodes. None of those choices had generated this particular kind of response. The difference with Steve Irwin was 7 weeks. The wound was still completely open. The people closest to him were still in the earliest stage of loss, and a cartoon had made a visual punchline out of the specific, sudden, shocking way he had died. Parker and Stone built into the episode a layer of self-awareness about this. Satan's initial reaction, telling the person he believes is wearing the costume that it is in poor taste so soon after Irwin's death, is the show acknowledging the critique before anyone outside the show could make it. The joke works precisely because Satan, who is not known for his sensitivity, draws the line at the Steve Irwin costume. The episode is aware of what it is doing and uses that awareness as part of the construction. Satan says it is too soon. The show does it anyway. Whether that self-awareness makes the joke more defensible or less defensible is a question the episode does not answer. The fact that the show knows it is crossing a line and crosses it anyway can be read as honesty. Here is what we are doing, we are not pretending otherwise. Or it can be read as the show using self-awareness as a shield against criticism it knows is coming. Both readings exist. The episode does not resolve them. Irwin himself had appeared on South Park before. A 1999 episode called Prehistoric Iceman featured Irwin as himself, attempting to approach and handle a man who had been frozen in ice and thawed out thousands of years later. Irwin approached the prehistoric man the same way he approached dangerous animals on his real television show, treating him as a specimen to be handled carefully, and speaking to the camera about him with enthusiastic narration. The 1999 episode aired while Irwin was alive and very much a public figure, and it generated no controversy. The parody was good-natured, played on his genuine television persona, and treated him with a kind of affection even within the absurd context of the story. The 2006 appearance was not affectionate. The 2006 appearance used the manner of his death as a costume joke and placed him at Satan's party in hell. The distinction between a living person being gently parodied and a man who had been dead for 7 weeks being depicted in the underworld with the instrument of his death sticking out of his chest is not a subtle one. What the Steve Irwin episode shares with the broader pattern of South Park scandals is the gap between what the show intended and what landed on real people outside the show. Parker and Stone intended a Halloween joke structured around the specific comedy of Satan being the voice of decency at his own party. What landed on Terry Irwin was a depiction of her husband's death as entertainment, 7 weeks after she watched him die. The show's intention and the widow's experience were in completely different places, and the controversy lived in that gap. South Park has never removed the episode. It airs in reruns, it is available to stream. It has not been treated as something the show needs to distance itself from or apologize for. Parker and Stone's position has remained consistent. The show makes the choices it makes, it does not adjust those choices based on the size of the response, and the Steve Irwin scene was part of a Halloween episode that was not designed to hurt anyone. The response from Irwin's family and colleagues was not an attempt to have the episode banned or legally challenged. Terry Irwin did not file complaints with broadcasting authorities. Mark Amy did not organize a boycott. The people closest to Steve Irwin expressed their grief and their objection, and then let the matter go, because there there was nothing more they could do, and because they had more important things to deal with than a 30-second cartoon scene. Steve Irwin is referenced again in a later episode called Stanley's Cup. In that episode, one of the children in the youth hockey team Stan is coaching tells him that the opposing team will not kill them. The response from another child is, "That is what Steve Irwin said about stingrays." The joke references his death again, more briefly, in a context that treats it as established shared knowledge between the characters and the audience. The show also named a real vessel in a 2009 episode called Whale Whores, which centers on the real-life television program Whale Wars. The main ship in that episode is named after Steve Irwin. This detail is not played as a joke. The ship in the real show Whale Wars was actually named after Steve Irwin in his honor. South Park used the real name of the real ship in the episode, which means the show that had depicted Irwin in hell 3 years earlier was also, in a separate context, using the name of a ship dedicated to his memory without comment. The Steve Irwin controversy does not rank among the largest institutional battles South Park ever fought. No broadcaster was taken to court over it. No country banned the episode. No legal threat materialized. A woman grieved publicly, and a man who had known Irwin well said what he thought, and the episode remained on television. What makes it worth understanding in the context of South Park's full history of scandals is that it shows what happens when the target of the joke has no organized response available. The Catholic Church had bishops and lawyers and broadcasters and advertisers and prime ministers. Scientology had internal memos and legal teams and celebrity pressure. China had the power to erase a show from an entire country's internet. Terry Irwin had grief and a friend who spoke to the press. South Park treated all of these responses the same way. The episode stayed on air regardless of who objected or how they objected. The size of the institutional response did not determine whether the show backed down. The show did not back down from organized legal campaigns by religious organizations. The show did not back down from China's total erasure of its entire catalog. The show certainly did not back down from the private grief of a widow. The consistency of that position is one of the things people mean when they talk about South Park's refusal to pick favorites. The show applies its willingness to continue in the same direction across every size and type of opposition. The question of whether that consistency is a principle or a posture is one that the show's entire history raises without fully resolving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the show never anticipated, and what produced the most uniquely strange controversy in its entire run, was the scandal that came not from outside pressure, but from inside the show itself. The joke that Parker and Stone had been making for 2 decades, built into the very name of a character who had appeared in hundreds of episodes, turned out to be something the show had to look at directly. And the way they chose to look at it was to gaslight an entire generation of viewers into believing the joke had never existed in the first place. Section 9. The Cartoon War. In April of 2006, South Park made a 2-part episode about a television network being too afraid to show an image of Muhammad. The network in the episode was Fox. The show within the show was Family Guy. The argument Parker and Stone were making was that censoring Muhammad while freely depicting every other religious figure was a double standard that rewarded fear and punished consistency. Comedy Central censored the episode. The network that aired South Park bleeped out and blocked the very content that the South Park episode was arguing should not be bleeped out and blocked. The show made a precise argument about what happens when media companies cave to pressure. Then the company airing the show caved to pressure while the episode was still on television. Parker and Stone delivered an episode about censorship and received censorship in return. The loop closed in real time, on air, in front of everyone watching. To understand the full weight of what happened with Cartoon Wars, the history that led to it needs to be laid out clearly, because the episode did not arrive without context. It was the 3rd time South Park had dealt with the question of Muhammad, and each time the situation had become more complicated than the time before. The first time was in 2001. South Park aired an episode called Super Best Friends. The premise of that episode involved a street magician named David Blaine forming a cult that the boys needed to stop. To combat the threat, Jesus assembled a team of the world's major religious figures to work together. The team included Jesus, Buddha, Joseph Smith, Krishna, Lao Tse, and Muhammad. Muhammad was depicted clearly on screen. He was drawn and animated and shown speaking and acting as a full character in the episode. He was portrayed as helpful and heroic. He was one of the good guys. Nobody complained. The episode aired without incident. Muhammad appeared uncensored in a South Park episode in 2001, and the response was silence. No protests, no threats, No formal complaints. The episode became part of the show's regular archive and was rerun without issue. Between 2001 and 2005, two things happened that changed the situation permanently. The first was the September 11th attacks in 2001, which shifted how American media thought about anything touching on Islam. The second was an event in late 2005 when a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published a series of cartoons depicting Muhammad. Several of the cartoons were drawn in ways that were directly critical or mocking. The response across parts of the Muslim world was severe. Protests broke out in multiple countries. Buildings associated with Denmark were attacked in several locations. Threats were made against the cartoonists. Some of the artists were forced to go into hiding or accept police protection for years afterward. The controversy over the Danish cartoons became one of the most internationally significant media events of the mid-2000s. By the time South Park wanted to use Muhammad again in 2006, Comedy Central was watching all of this closely. The network was not prepared to handle the kind of response the Danish cartoons had generated. They made clear to Parker and Stone that depicting Muhammad on screen was something they were not comfortable with. Parker and Stone decided to make an episode about exactly that decision. Cartoon Wars Part 1 aired on April 5th, 2006. It is the third episode of Season 10. The story begins with news spreading through South Park that the animated television show Family Guy is about to air an episode featuring Muhammad in a cutaway gag. The residents of South Park panic. They begin evacuating the town. They board up their windows and prepare for the kind of violent response that the Danish cartoon controversy had produced overseas. The episode captures the specific anxiety of a society that has absorbed the lesson that depicting Muhammad is dangerous without fully working through what that lesson means for a country built around free expression. Cartman sees an opportunity in the panic. He has always hated Family Guy and everything about how Family Guy is made. His hatred in the episode is specific and detailed. He argues that Family Guy does not have real writers who build real stories. He argues instead that the show is produced by manatees, large, slow-moving sea mammals who push around balls with words written on them and combine those words randomly to generate jokes that are then inserted into the show with no connection to story or character. The cutaway gag format that Family Guy built its identity around, in Cartman's view, is not comedy. It is random content generation with no artistic value. Cartman travels to Hollywood to try to get the Family Guy episode pulled before it airs. He wants to convince the Fox network to cancel the episode. Kyle, who understands that Cartman's motivations have nothing to do with protecting anyone from harm and everything to do with his personal contempt for Family Guy, follows him to try to stop whatever Cartman is actually planning. The episode splits its attention between Cartman's journey to Hollywood and the panic spreading through South Park. Both storylines are built around the same central question. When a piece of content might cause violent reactions, who gets to decide whether it still gets made and aired? Cartoon Wars Part 2 aired 1 week later on April 12, 2006. In the second part, Cartman reaches the Fox network and makes his case for pulling the Family Guy episode. Kyle makes his counter-argument. Kyle's position is straightforward. If the episode gets pulled because people are afraid of what might happen if it airs, then the message sent to everyone watching is that threatening violence is an effective way to control what gets put on television. The moment a network censors itself because of fear, every group that wants something removed from television learns that fear is the tool that works. The Fox executive in the episode eventually agrees with Cartman and decides to pull the Muhammad scene from the Family Guy episode. He frames this as a responsible decision that protects people from harm. The show presents this as a failure of nerve dressed up as reasonable caution. Parker and Stone had built the entire two-part episode around a simple and clear argument. Censoring Muhammad while freely depicting Jesus, Buddha, and every other religious figure creates a double standard. That double standard does not protect anyone. What it actually does is tell the world that threatening violence against a media company will produce results. The episode was a defense of consistency. Treat all religious figures the same way or admit that you are making decisions based on fear rather than principle. Comedy Central received the finished episodes from Parker and Stone. For Part 1, the network aired the episode largely as delivered. The Muhammad question in Part 1 is still developing. The episode is set up, and the most direct content appears in Part 2. In Part 2, the moment arrives where the Family Guy episode within the show is about to air the Muhammad scene. The South Park episode builds to this point over its full runtime. The audience is watching a show about whether a network will show a depiction of Muhammad, and that show is itself deciding whether it will show a depiction of Muhammad. Comedy Central blocked the scene. The network inserted a black screen in place of the moment where Muhammad would have appeared in the Family Guy episode within the South Park episode. The black screen ran for a period of time that represented the duration of the scene. Then the South Park episode continued. Parker and Stone had argued inside their own episode that blocking this exact kind of content was the wrong decision. Comedy Central had then made exactly that decision about their episode while it was airing. The specific irony was not lost on anyone watching. The episode that argued against censoring Muhammad was itself censored at the exact moment it would have shown Muhammad. The show made its point by having its point demonstrated against it in real time. Parker and Stone expressed their frustration publicly. Their position was consistent with everything they had argued inside the episode itself. The censorship proved the episode right. If a network would block an image because it was afraid of the response, then the lesson broadcast to every viewer was that fear was the correct response, and that threatening violence produced the desired result. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, who was the secondary target of the episode because of how Cartoon Wars depicted his show's creative process, gave his response in a brief public statement. He called the episode funny and accurate. The man whose show had been compared to manatee-generated random content said the episodes were good and correct. This was either a display of genuine good humor or a calculated choice to avoid prolonged conflict, and possibly both. The Cartoon Wars episodes were included in the show's regular streaming catalog for years after they aired. Then, sometime after the 200 and 201 controversy in 2010, the episodes were removed from streaming platforms. They joined Super Best Friends, 200 and 201, as South Park episodes that could not be watched legally online. All 5 unavailable episodes share the same common element. Muhammad appears in all of them, or is a central subject of all of them. The removal of Cartoon Wars from streaming created a specific and somewhat absurd situation. The episodes that argued most directly against the censorship of Muhammad-related content became censored content themselves. They are episodes about why pulling shows is wrong that were pulled. They made the case for consistency and then received the consistent treatment that all Muhammad-adjacent South Park content eventually received. The Super Best Friends episode from 2001, the one where Muhammad appeared uncensored with no controversy, was retroactively caught in the same net. By the time the later controversies had accumulated, having Muhammad appear anywhere in the archive felt like a liability to the companies managing the show's distribution. Super Best Friends had aired for years in reruns without anyone objecting. It was removed anyway, not because it had caused problems, but because the category of content it belonged to had become too complicated to leave accessible. The result is that the 2001 version of Muhammad, heroic, uncensored, a positive portrayal with no satirical edge, is now less available than the 2006 and 2010 versions that were specifically designed to provoke debate about depicting him. The episodes made with the most care not to offend became unavailable alongside the episodes that were deliberately pushing limits. Cartoon Wars also established something important about how Parker and Stone operated when their network constrained them. The Bloody Mary controversy produced a quiet removal from the rerun schedule and a quiet return to rotation months later. The Isaac Hayes situation produced an angry public statement that called Scientology by name and promised a million-year war. The Cartoon Wars censorship produced something different. Parker and Stone absorbed it, documented their frustration, and kept making episodes. They did not declare a public war on Comedy Central. They did not demand the scene be restored in later airings. They moved forward. This pattern, express frustration clearly, hold the position publicly, continue working, is how Parker and Stone have responded to almost every institutional constraint in the show's history. They do not retreat, and they do not escalate into extended public campaigns against the people they work with. They say what they think, loudly and with specific language, and then they go back to making South Park. The most extreme version of this pattern would come 4 years later with 200 and 201, where the frustration was expressed through a statement about the specific content of Kyle's speech and then fell mostly silent. By the time those episodes were produced, Parker and Stone had already been through Cartoon Wars. They had already seen Comedy Central censor an episode in real time about real-time censorship. They had already made the argument as clearly as it could be made and watched the argument be demonstrated against itself. When 200 and 201 arrived and the bleeps went in, there was almost nothing left to say that the previous 4 years had not already said. Parker and Stone noted in the 200 and 201 controversy that that their only regret about Cartoon Wars was that their mockery of Family Guy had generated more attention than the episode's central argument about censorship. The Family Guy content, the manatee jokes, the cutaway gag critique, was what most people talked about. The censorship argument was treated as secondary. 4 years later, with the threats against their lives and Kyle's speech buried under a solid minute of bleeping, the censorship argument was impossible to treat as secondary. There was nothing else to look at. The Cartoon Wars episodes exist now in the specific category of things South Park made that are no longer freely accessible because the world they were responding to turned out to be more serious than anyone involved had fully anticipated. Parker and Stone made episodes about the danger of caving to fear. The fear proved real enough that the episodes themselves became casualties of it. The argument they made was correct. The argument being correct did not protect the argument. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final South Park scandal in this collection does not involve censorship from outside the show or pressure from religious organizations or foreign governments or corporate parents. The last one is about the show looking at itself, at a character it had used for years in ways that raised questions the show had never fully answered, and deciding that something needed to change. The way Parker and Stone made that change and what they did to the entire archive of the show in the process turned out to be one of the most quietly radical things South Park had ever done. And like Scott Tenorman Must Die, it produced almost no external controversy at all. The scandal was entirely between the show and the audience that had been watching it for 25 years. Section 10, the show that launched 1,000 protests. Everything that came before this section, the death threats, the Scientology pressure, the China ban, the Catholic Church's legal campaigns across multiple countries, the censored speech about censorship, the dead celebrity at a Halloween party, all of it was possible because South Park survived its first year on television. And surviving that first year was not guaranteed. The show launched into a media environment that was actively hostile to exactly what it was, in front of an audience that had never seen anything quite like it, and it became the fastest growing program in the history of basic cable television in the United States at that time. Those two things, the hostility and the growth, were not separate events. They were the same event. To understand how South Park got to television at all, the beginning needs to be told from the actual beginning, which is not August of 1997 when the show premiered, but several years earlier when two young men from Colorado made a short animated film about Jesus Christ and Frosty the Snowman fighting each other. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met while studying at the University of Colorado in Boulder. They began making short animated films together while still students. In 1992, they produced a short called The Spirit of Christmas, sometimes referred to as Jesus versus Frosty, in which Jesus and Frosty the Snowman have a physical confrontation. The animation was rough and cheap. The humor was crude and deliberately irreverent about religious imagery. The short featured early versions of characters who would eventually become the main boys of South Park, though they were unnamed and undeveloped at that stage. The short circulated among people who saw it and found it funny. It reached a man named Brian Graydon, who was working as a development executive at Fox at the time. Graydon liked what Parker and Stone had made enough that he paid them $2,000 to produce a second short as a video Christmas card he could send to people he knew in the entertainment industry. Parker and Stone took the money and made a second version of The Spirit of Christmas in 1995, this time featuring Jesus and Santa Claus in a fight over the true meaning of Christmas. The boys in this version were named Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. The animation was still simple. The humor was still aggressively irreverent. Santa Claus was depicted in violent combat with Jesus. The language was profane and uncensored. Graydon sent the short to his contacts as intended, but the short did not stay contained to Graydon's professional network. People who received it copied it and sent it to others. This was 1995 and early 1996. Before the internet had become the primary way people shared video content, and the short spread through a combination of early internet file sharing and physical tape copying. It reached people across the entertainment industry and beyond. By the time Parker and Stone were being discussed as potential creators of a television series, their short had already been seen by a significant number of people who worked in television. Comedy Central approached them. The network was looking for animated content, and the Jesus vs. Santa short had demonstrated that Parker and Stone could make something that people wanted to share and watch repeatedly. The deal was made. South Park was ordered as a series. Parker and Stone built out the town, the characters, and the show's fundamental approach from the foundation of what they had already created in those two short films. The show premiered on August 13th, 1997, with an episode called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. The title contained the show's mission statement in 6 words. The episode featured one of the 4 main characters being subjected to an alien medical procedure in his lower body, the details of which were played for comedy throughout the runtime. Flaming gas erupted from the affected area at intervals. The alien beings responsible were depicted conducting their experiments with clinical indifference. The episode was built around a joke that would have been considered completely unacceptable on any mainstream American network at that time, delivered with the complete confidence of people who had decided in advance that they were not going to make adjustments based on what was considered acceptable. Comedy Central aired it. The episode was rated TVMA, the strongest content warning available for American cable television at the time, and people watched it. Within weeks of premiering, South Park was doing something that basic cable animated shows were not supposed to be able to do. It was generating genuine mainstream cultural conversation. People who were not the typical audience for late-night cable animation were watching it and talking about it. College students were watching it in groups. Office workers were discussing specific scenes the next morning. The 4 boys from a small Colorado town were becoming recognizable cultural figures faster than anyone at Comedy Central had anticipated. The growth of the show's audience happened in direct proportion to the growth of the outrage being directed at it. Every time a parenting organization issued a statement about South Park being dangerous, more people tuned in to see what the danger was. Every time a news program ran a segment asking whether South Park was appropriate viewing, the segment functioned as free advertising for a show that Comedy Central could not have afforded to buy at that price. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog organization that tracks what it considers inappropriate content on American television, identified South Park as one of the most harmful shows on television almost immediately after it premiered. The council had been founded in 1995 by a media critic named Brent Bozell, and had developed a significant public presence through its campaigns against content it deemed harmful to families and children. South Park represented exactly the kind of target the council had been organized to fight. A program airing on a channel available in millions of American homes, featuring children as its main characters, built around language and subject matter that the council argued no child should be exposed to. The council's objections were specific and documented. The show featured the word hell in its first season with regularity that had led to complaints. It featured the ongoing death of Kenny in every episode of the first several seasons, with Kenny being killed in a new and often violent way each time, and being alive again the following week with no explanation. It featured Cartman using language and expressing views that no child in a mainstream American television program had ever been allowed to express. It featured Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo, a talking piece of fecal matter who served as a holiday character in an episode that aired during the Christmas season and was treated by the show with the warmth and sentiment usually reserved for more traditional Christmas specials. Mr. Hanky became one of the most talked about elements of the first season precisely because of the gap between the form and the content. The episode Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo was structured as a Christmas special in the tradition of the animated holiday programs that had been a staple of American television since the 1960s. It had the visual warmth and narrative sentiment of those specials. The central character was a piece of feces who sang and danced. The episode was aired during the holiday season and treated its subject with total sincerity. Parker and Stone were not mocking the Christmas special format through distance or irony. They were executing the Christmas special format faithfully with content that was completely incompatible with the form, and the collision of those two things produced something that genuinely did not have a precedent in American television. The response from parenting groups treated Mr. Hanky as evidence of a deliberate assault on family values rather than as a creative choice made by two people who found the combination funny. This interpretation was not entirely wrong. Parker and Stone were clearly aware that the choice was provocative, but it missed the specificity of what the show was doing, which was not simply trying to offend people, but trying to create a particular kind of collision between expectation and reality that had its own internal logic. Schools across the United States became a specific front in the early South Park controversy. The show's characters and imagery had become commercially available on merchandise almost immediately after the show's premiere. T-shirts, hats, and other items featuring the main characters spread quickly through the consumer market and into schools. School administrators who found the show offensive and inappropriate began banning students from wearing South Park merchandise on school grounds. Schools in New Jersey organized a coordinated effort by school principals to notify parents about the show's content and to discourage children from watching it. A specific elementary school in Cherokee County in the state of Georgia, called Hickory Flat Elementary, issued a formal ban on any South Park clothing or merchandise being worn on school property. The school's decision was covered by local news outlets and became part of the broader conversation about whether the show was appropriate. A school in the United Kingdom became part of the story when its headmaster asked parents directly not to allow their children to watch South Park. The request generated enough attention that it was reported in British media, adding an international dimension to what had largely been an American controversy up to that point. The show entered the conversation about the V-chip. The V-chip was a technology that Congress had required to be built into new American televisions through the Telecommunications Act of 1996. The chip allowed parents to program their television sets to block content based on its rating. The purpose was to give parents a tool to prevent their children from watching content that had been rated as inappropriate without requiring them to be physically present to change the channel. South Park was cited repeatedly in congressional discussions and in public debates as the specific kind of content the V-chip had been designed to address. A show rated TVMA, featuring children as characters, airing in the early evening hours when children might be watching, this was the exact situation that the V-chip legislation had been built to handle. The fact that South Park's four main characters were elementary school children created a particular tension in the coverage of the controversy. A show aimed at adults that featured adult characters in adult situations was something American media culture had established processes for discussing and containing. South Park was something different. Its main characters were 9 and 10 years old. They were in elementary school. They went home to their parents at the end of each episode, and they spoke in ways that no child on an American television program had ever been allowed to speak, held views that no child character had ever been allowed to hold, and encountered situations that went far beyond anything in the children's programming they superficially resembled. The confusion about who the show was actually for was genuine and widespread in the first year. Parents who had not watched the show heard that it featured children and assumed it was aimed at children. Children who heard about it at school wanted to watch it. Adults who watched it found themselves in the unusual position of enjoying a show whose characters were the same age as their own kids. The show existed in a category that American television had not fully developed the tools to discuss. Comedy Central's response to the controversy was to continue airing the show. This was not a passive decision. The network understood clearly that the controversy and the ratings growth were connected. Every parenting council report, every school ban, every congressional mention, every news segment asking whether South Park had gone too far sent more viewers to the show. Comedy Central had the show that everyone was arguing about, and that argument was the most valuable thing the show could have had in its first year. By the end of the first season, South Park had become a genuine cultural phenomenon in a way that extended well beyond the typical reach of basic cable animation. The four boys, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, were recognizable to people who had never watched a single episode. The show's humor, its specific combination of crude physical comedy with surprisingly precise social observation, had been discussed in mainstream publications that would not typically cover animated cable programming. The controversy had done exactly what controversies do when the underlying product is actually good. It created an audience far larger than the show would have found through ordinary means. The first season aired 9 episodes before the production schedule required a break. Each episode moved the show's cultural presence forward. The pilot's alien anal probe joke established the show's willingness to go anywhere. The episode Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, which featured a gay character treated with genuine affection and whose ending argued for the inclusion of gay people in mainstream life, demonstrated that the show's offensiveness was not purely nihilistic. It had a point of view, and that point of view was sometimes warmer than the surface suggested. The Christmas episode with Mr. Hanky became one of the most talked about things on television that holiday season. Not because it was the best Christmas programming available, but because it was the most impossible to ignore. The Parents Television Council gave South Park one of its lowest ratings for family appropriateness in its first season, and continued to do so in subsequent seasons. The council's tracking of the show's content became itself a kind of ongoing documentation of everything South Park was willing to do. The show regularly appeared on the council's list of programs it considered most harmful to children. Parker and Stone were aware of this and showed no signs of adjusting their approach in response to it. The most significant thing about the first-year controversy, seen from the distance of nearly 3 decades, is what it established about the relationship between the show and its audience. The people who watched South Park in 1997 and 1998 were not accidentally finding it. They were seeking it out specifically because they had heard it was something that adults were trying to prevent them from watching. The audience that built around South Park in its first year was an audience that had been pre-selected for a tolerance of, or active interest in, content that institutional voices were calling harmful. This audience was exactly the audience Parker and Stone needed. A show that depended on its willingness to offend needed an audience that understood the offending was part of the project, and not a sign that the project had failed. The first-year controversy functioned as a sorting mechanism. The people who were turned away by the Parenting Council reports and the school bans and the congressional mentions were not the audience South Park was trying to reach. The people who were drawn toward the show by exactly those reports were. The show that Comedy Central had ordered as a basic cable animated series became, within 12 months of its premiere, one of the most culturally significant and hotly debated programs on American television. The ratings it was doing on basic cable were extraordinary for the time and for the medium. The conversation it was generating extended from school board meetings to congressional hearings to dinner tables in households across the country. And none of the controversy stopped it. None of the Parenting Council reports changed what was in the episodes. None of the school merchandise bans affected what Parker and Stone wrote. The V-chip debate produced no new restrictions on when or how South Park could air. Every institution that mobilized against the show in its first year failed to alter the show in any meaningful way. The show they wanted gone became more popular every time they said so. This is the pattern that all 10 scandals in this collection describe from different angles. The Catholic Church mobilized bishops and lawyers and prime ministers across multiple countries and the Bloody Mary. The episode is still on streaming. China erased the entire show from its national internet, and South Park kept making episodes. A radical group threatened Parker and Stone's lives, and Comedy Central censored their work. And 15 years later, the only lasting result is that 5 episodes remain unavailable, while the show continues producing new content across 28 seasons. Scientology forced a sick man's resignation through people acting without his knowledge, and the episode they wanted pulled became an Emmy nominee that TV Guide placed in the top 20 television episodes of all time. The school boards that banned the t-shirts, the parents who wrote letters to Comedy Central, the congressional figures who cited South Park in debates about the V-chip, the headmaster in the United Kingdom who asked parents not to let their children watch, none of them changed anything. The show they were objecting to in 1997 and 1998 was still running in 2026. The boys from South Park Elementary are still in 4th grade. Cartman is still doing things that would get a real person arrested. Kenny is still dying. The format that launched a nationwide moral panic in its first 12 months had enough internal life to keep running for nearly 3 decades. What the first year established that everything afterward depended on was simple. The show could survive opposition. Not just survive it, grow through it. Every controversy that followed in the next 27 years was handled by a show that had already learned in its very first season that the people trying to stop it were also the people making it impossible to look away from. Parker and Stone made the show they wanted to make in 1997, and they kept making that same show regardless of what was thrown at it. The content changed, the targets changed, the world changed around them significantly enough that some jokes aged poorly, and others aged into things nobody expected. But the fundamental decision to say what they wanted to say, to not adjust based on who was upset, to treat all targets consistently and follow the joke wherever it led, remained constant from the pilot to the present. 10 scandals across 28 seasons. Death threats, banned episodes, erased archives, forged resignation letters, widows in grief, courts in New Zealand, a country of 1.4 billion people removing every trace of the show from its internet, and a character whose name was quietly changed across the entire history of the show without anyone being allowed to admit the original name had ever existed. South Park survived all of it. The question of whether surviving it makes the show right or simply makes it resilient is one the show has never stopped asking, and has never been willing to answer cleanly. What the full picture of these 10 scandals reveals, when all of them are placed side by side, is something that no single controversy communicates on its own. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.